Hello. Thanks for joining me after lunch to chat about something I've been doing for a while. How many of you here have already built a mobile app? Okay, so several of you. How many of you have built one but would like to know a little more? I feel like I always will raise my own hand in my own talk for this. Welcome. Today I'm going to show you a lot of the ways that I've had to think about approaching a real project. I've been working on mobile apps before they were popular because I was one of those edge people who was in early. And like most of our projects, I think the real value is in everything we do outside of the code because, especially now, it's trivial to find certain kinds of code snippets that will work for your situation, and that's really cool. But today, this is more about how do you actually build a real project around this app as a developer. It's a cool topic that I've been doing for about 10 to 15 years now. I thought I would get this done early. If you're interested in the slide deck, this is where it's going to be. I actually would have updated it today, so if you wait about an hour, I'll put it up, okay? How many of you have been playing around with mobile for more than 5 years? Okay, so like a couple of you. Everybody else is in that wonderful know enough to be dangerous stage, right? That was definitely me for a long time. So if you're interested in just some of the takeaways in here, here's the slide deck for that. You're probably wondering who I am. So my name's Heather. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri, and I've been coming to NDC for a little while now. But one thing that is newer for me is that I finally decided to jump into the startup world and get into fintech. And so even though this was actually, fun fact, this was my first talk I ever gave at a developer conference about 8 years ago, and I've completely updated it because I keep getting asked questions even now about these kinds of things. So what I'm going to show you a little bit is what it's like for me to be building this now. So I'm going to use my own app that I'm building right now as an example often because it's just very front of mind, but that doesn't have to be your app. So just giving you a little bit of background as to why I'm going to skew things the way I am. Okay? All right, here's an overview of what you're going to learn. We're going to talk about what your desired result is, and there's going to be a lot of emphasis spent on your decision making, okay? Again, I believe you're all pretty brilliant. I'm quite sure you can figure out how to do an API call for an Android app. That's not why we're here. We're here to talk about if we should or shouldn't, and how do you think about the process along the way, okay? This is kind of a David and Goliath theme, so I get to inject some fun imagery that I've been doing for a long time. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to pick your tech stack and why you would do it. We spend a little bit of time here. All of you, I'm sure, can pick up any kind of stack you'd like at the drop of a hat, right? Because we are all eternal learners. But sometimes it doesn't make sense, and you have to make the best choice for you. Then we're going to kind of talk about what it means to divide and conquer your thinking on the subject, a bit about security, this is a good topic for me, where to kind of find your weakest links and how to think about them as a mobile developer, the process of publishing. Anybody published a mobile app here? We are part of that group of pain. It is a special process that web developers will never know the pain of. I drew a tree years ago in Microsoft Paint, and just for you all, it has now been updated and it looks nice and pretty. I much prefer it now, but it was definitely something that looked like a 5-year-old drew it back in the day. So hopefully that'll be a way to take a little bit of a quick look at your mobile architecture diagram. That's why it's called the mat tree. And of course, imparting advice. So hopefully you're here for just the thinking and the approach of what it means to successfully build a mobile app, because you have to pull from so many of my failures in it. I've built for major Fortune 50 companies apps, along with now my own, and I can tell you that this is the stuff that I love to sit and talk shop about. It's almost never the code. It's almost always the decisions that led to the code. I have a strong opinion that it's difficult to do agile development with mobile. I think you kind of have to have at least a baby waterfall to it, because so many of the decisions downstream of what you made in the beginning will either haunt you or make you feel like you've got everything together. You ready? Yeah. Let's start by asking the crucial question, what is your desired result? So what kind of end product are you aiming for? I know what you're thinking. Well, I mean, obviously, I just want to build the best mobile app and dominate the competition, right? That's what you want to do and show how much better it is if you build it your way. Of course you do, and we all want something that makes us proud, but in the real world, things never go as planned, and we might have great ideas, especially if we've been in this a little bit, we've done it for a few years, but when it comes to results, we really need to focus, okay? Is this a game you're building? Is this a forms-based application? Maybe even a voting app someday, you never know. Is it going to be government regulated? The more specific you can be about your product, the better equipped you're going to be to make the right decisions going throughout the development process. So remember, what we envision in our heads is almost not ever what it ends up happening. That's why it's crucial to define the aspects early on. A lot of mobile app developers are everything. We are the product owner. We are the graphic designer. We are the one who approaches all of it, right? It is a wonderful, lonely road, and luckily for me, I got to be on an entire team with staff that did individual roles, and that was very cool, and I got to see what it meant to scale up and have a team of 7, but I've also been the lone mobile developer. And regardless of what role you take, it's very important you understand the steps around it. So take a good look at your options. You have to consider your target audience, probably more than most developers ever do, and your data needs and your overall goals. So the clearer you are about your end product from the start, the smoother your development journey will be. So I want to ask each of you to think of an end result. You could pick, I want to build the next Pokemon Go, or I want to build the next day trading app, or whatever it is. Please have your end result in mind right now as we go through the rest of my slides, okay? Because you have to start with that in order to answer your questions about your own app. I hate the word, but journey, okay? Make sense? All right. For me, I've discovered that it's going to be different depending on where the user really lives. Is it, when I say lives, I mean, where is this app going to live with your user? Is it a daily occurrence? Is it mostly just once in a while, like maybe checking your bank balance? Does it need to have offline functionality for a toddler on an airplane? Or you desperately need to have something for them to play? There's a lot of different considerations for this. And the big one I never did initially, but then I started to do for projects after, was to establish target performance. Like, I needed to know how much battery was consuming, all of that very early, because if you don't have a performance target for it, people will just uninstall your app because it just consumes a lot of memory or consumes a lot of battery or just space in general. This is especially true for media apps. You know, when you're building your own camera and file system to store all your videos, et cetera, or maybe some sort of like AI videos you're doing, it can very rapidly spiral, and even though you built a really cool app, the users won't use it. And a lot of this stuff is, of course, why would they use it in the first place, an esoteric question. Or maybe you don't get to make the decision as to whether or not to build this. You're just getting paid a lot of money per year to build this for somebody. That was definitely my experience. Why are we building this? There's because they're spending $500,000 on building this. That's what we're doing. And like, okay. But understand that you can still have success even within a very strange target for a mobile app. And making sure that platform compatibility is actually there. There's a really cool app for somebody who travels a lot that I enjoy, but it only lives on the Apple system, which sounds like it's not a big deal. But all my friends have Android phones, so we could never share our stats together of all of our travels. It just wasn't there because it wasn't a priority for the mobile app developer, because they made a decision that their demographic pretty much only uses iPhones. So that's okay. But just something to consider is that you may want to roll out everywhere, but it may not be the right choice. And we'll dig into that a little bit. Okay, so you know what you want to build, right? Let me ask you this question. Is it consumer deployed or like B2B? Has anybody ever done a B2B deployed mobile app? Okay, a couple of you, so you understand. Many people automatically think of consumer apps that go in the App Store or the Play Store, but B2B apps are very much growing in popularity, especially within larger companies or government organizations, and they have a completely different set of priorities for you because it's not going to be something that people are going to write reviews on or put stars on. This process is pretty private and exclusive to you. Is it going to be self-contained, or is it going to be a service-driven app? Because I've done APIs for 15 years, I'm like, service-driven app. Put nothing in that app. I just want it all on the server and to sync, right? Because what happens if they lose their phone? What happens if that? Take a banking app, for example. It's service-driven because it needs to be having access to real time. There's also some security concerns about token expirations and when was the last time somebody actually looked at that? Because it's such sensitive data, right? It's lots of rules about protecting that data, and oftentimes it'll just be server-driven. On the other hand, some apps never touch the server and operate entirely on their own. Those are actually some of my favorite ones because you have to think about them in that closed ecosystem. They're often more efficient and faster because you don't have to wait for all of that data to load. You have to decide, are you going to go local storage or data sync to server? How much data does your app handle, and where does it live? Is it a dummy app that just displays information? Nothing wrong with that. You just have to make that decision. Or does it have substantial logic and data stored on the phone itself for a game or something that uses the accelerometer because you're displaying scientific information or sensor data that's coming in right away? These decisions will shape everything from your development approach to your app's performance and user experience. All right, so have you made the decision? Are you customer deployed or B2B, self-contained or self-driven, service-driven, or local storage or data sync? We made our decisions, right? All right, moving on. So let's talk about the first approach here. This is a popular one. If you consider the market share, a lot of people would think that iPhone is the first one that comes to mind that would be supported because it's popularized by the media. But because the media loves Apple products. It also looks very aesthetically pleasing to always show a photo of an iPhone when it talks about consumers and mobile. I love Apple products. They're great. I'm not saying they're not great, but most people have an Android phone, as you can tell. And this was just pulled at the end of 2024. This data is fresh. A lot of this has to do with globalization because of this reason and for the different price points that you can get it. So this is just over time how the market share has pretty much been dominated since, I would say, roughly 2015. That's really when it went up, 2014. That's a pretty good run. It's a good 10-year run of Android being the dominant one, even though it wasn't an early adoption. It is now. But in the USA, the iPhone leads. So if that's your market that you're targeting, you'll make different decisions, yeah? That's our market share, which is crazy. So a lot of app developers in the States make the mistake of not rolling out, again, that Android version. I am an Android fan. I do have an Android phone. It's a very nice Android phone, very expensive one, but the rest of the world may have a cheaper version. And iOS, it just doesn't hit the right demographic for many countries. But in our country, even middle class can have an iPhone because of the cost and how much it's subsidized by a lot of our telcos, okay? So if you're wanting to roll it out in our country, you just make different decisions about which app to build first. There's a little bit of the history of that market share. It's kind of always been a dominant theme for us. But look at the difference in iPhone versus Android by country. Right? That's pretty interesting. I mean, look at Spain. That's hardly any there in comparison, right? But it's a little flip for US and Australia. We really like our iPhones there. But also, these are wealthy countries. So it kind of stands to reason that people can afford to get like the best phone, or at least the best phone to them. But look at the difference in spending. So even if you roll something out, if you're going to have in-app purchases, you'll find that your users are very different depending on which ecosystem they're on. Often, iOS will get rolled out first because people have more money to spend in the App Store on in-app purchases. So does this matter to you? Maybe. Consumer spending globally in-app purchases on the App Store for iPhone users reached $124 billion at the end of 2024, while app spending amounts on the Google Play Store for Android reach 51 billion. That's a pretty huge difference. Around 1.8 million apps are currently available for iPhone users worldwide, but the number in the Google Play Store is 2.44 million. So a lot more to sift through. Right, so here's lots of information about why this matters and why it's important. I've been a part of many projects where they actually hadn't decided who their target demographic is, where they lived, what they were going to do, so you should do that for them. Why? Because there's nothing worse than launching an app you spent a lot of time on and you just don't have the adoption or you just don't hit the right users. And as a developer, it's okay to speak up and say, well, here's some basic stats on this. I think we should probably prioritize this on our Jira board versus that on our Jira board, okay? All right, so you've made your decision about how your rollout's gonna go, right, in your head? Let's talk about a global app, all right? Which one do you launch first? How much time do you put into bugs? How do you prioritize which platform bugs you go conquer first? What is the ratio of time you're going to split between them? It's important to just really look at that market share and what is your best winning shot? What is your best winning shot for the best ROI of your time? You're going to be very busy as you build. So let's talk about the first approach you could do in your stack. If you're going iOS, you're looking at Swift development using Xcode. And heads up, you'll need a Mac for this. It's non-negotiable. For Android, you're dealing with Java or Kotlin in Android Studio, right? So you could use Eclipse or another JVM environment, but honestly, Android Studio was made for this many years ago, and I liked it. Although now things are baked into all sorts of IDEs. You're not just kept to one now. The nice thing about Android development is you can do it on a Windows or a Mac, so it's your choice. At my previous company, we had a big team doing native development. We actually split our teams. So we had 6 Android developers and 6 iOS developers. And yep, it is duplicating some work, for sure. But there were some serious pros to this approach. There you go. All right, so let's talk about these pros. First off, you get a natural development cycle. Everything is supported, documentation is easier to find, and both Apple and Google provide detailed tutorials. It's straightforward, which is nice. You also get full access to all the libraries and hardware features. This becomes really crucial with new releases. If you wanted to implement facial recognition, maybe only certain phones had that at the time when you were doing it. With the native approach, you'd have access to those APIs right away because it's rolled out by the manufacturer. Another pro is like a consistent user interface that people are used to experiencing, and it's all built in, and it's all very native, you know, it's all built in. It's the way it's supposed to be done, and the way that Apple and Google would love for you to do it. And you generally have better ways to handle loose version changes because it's built for that. I say better loosely because you're still dealing with manufacturer upgrades between them, but at least it's all in one ecosystem. Obviously, native apps can operate offline, so can other ones, but this is another thing to put out there is that it's a very easy API to switch. And native apps often have specific security features that are just available to you at the API level that sometimes are just built in, so you don't have to build some of that yourself. Obviously, you're going to have a security plan, but a lot of the times they just gatekeep it and say, well, this is the only path for security that we're doing for you, or you won't get accepted to the App Store. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. There are some significant cons to the native approach. The learning curve is pretty steep. If you are a solo developer or a weekend warrior, you're looking at learning multiple environments, languages, operating systems, each with their own quirks, right? So that's potentially 6 different things to master just to get an app out there. And it's okay. I'm sure a lot of you could do it in a weekend. I'm just not that person. I'm very methodical. I like to understand why I'm pushing a button. Why did I call this API? Why is this working? Why is it not? How do I debug this? And honestly, it does take time, and you have to kind of play. You have to do multiple different kinds of projects to really feel it out. Most developers agree that you need to support both iOS and Android. Most, okay? Which means learning both ecosystems anyway. It can also be, so you need some of that specific platform expertise. You can't really reuse a lot of the code. We'll get to other ways to do that in a bit. And it can just kind of also be, slower time to market. It can take longer. And of course, the thing that really gets me is, the limited code reuse and higher costs of duplication. I don't want to duplicate my code. I don't enjoy doing that. But it turns out the way things are solved in Swift at a lower level is actually different than it is in Kotlin or in the Android ecosystem. And so you might want to get to this end goal, but reverse engineering that is going to kind of look different depending on that. I'm sure some of you have had this pain, is that you think, this is an obvious API feature I can do on an iPhone, and it just doesn't exist over here in Android, or vice versa. And so you're like, wait, do I have to build that from scratch in order for that functionality to exist? Do I need it? Etc. And we're not even talking about features that you are putting in your app, just the availability of an API to even do something for you. So again, I like to not repeat myself. I'm a very dry developer, and that's my real pain point with it. While it does offer some clear advantages, it's crucial to weigh the cons carefully against your projects and your resources. Which brings us to the cross-platform compiled approach. That write once, run everywhere, isn't it fun? The promise of reducing your time and costs, and the seamless native integration that's there, and the performance optimization that can totally happen because somebody else that's not you has thought about how to put together a framework that can handle all these things easily and not bloated at all. Absolutely. That's the promise of doing a cross-platform compiled. I've done a lot in this space, so of course I have opinions. There are some really good pros to it, but there are some cons. However, look at where it leads. Native still leads by a huge margin when it comes to new apps that are being developed. Hybrid is really gaining traction, but cross-platform is still done at least at some rate, about 30% of the time. A lot of the big paying gigs I have done, they chose cross-platform because they only had a team that could do it in a certain language for whatever reason, and it was just a resource allocation decision instead of having people that were separate. Yeah. So obviously the good thing is code can be done on Windows or a Mac, but a Mac is required for building the iOS files themselves. This is different from hybrid. It's actually compiled down to the device's binary, which means, in theory, you should have access to every library. The beauty here is that you can code in your language of choice and share the same code base for both iOS and Android. You'll typically work with a custom IDE or a custom IDE plugin. You can develop on Windows or Mac, but again, the actual building of the files needs to still be done on the Mac. It's a bit of an if-else situation if we are adding to the process. This approach is really powerful because it facilitates sharing your data and business logic. You don't have to replicate that. You can separate your UI layers too, which you absolutely should separate your UI layers because nobody wants to use an app on iOS that looks like an Android menu. Like that's not a fun experience for anybody, which means you have to separate that a little bit. So we're already starting to break apart this monolithic approach into its parts. I know this isn't a design class, but trust me on this one, always separate your UI. Always separate it. Shares the majority of the business logic is the reason that I've always approached it. Any new OS changes that happen will be put in kind of to a DLL library for you, and it allows you to code in one language. I already said that. But the cons is that it can be a little costly. There are entire companies that have spun up just to solve this cross-platform approach, and it does require more work than write once, code everywhere. If you decide that you want to do the latest thing that has come out on just one of your ecosystems, that's always the case. Hey, I want to do this new biometrics or these new really cool accelerometer. Then all of a sudden now you are separating your business logic as well. You are determining where you're going to be. And the recipes for how to do this stuff is all over Reddit, all over Stack Overflow, all over different communities. There's not like one place you can go except for maybe the Like if you choose a cross-platform product, sometimes they'll have some basic recipes for you, but how to actually publish things all the way that are a real working app and not a proof of concept, those are harder. And to kind of hear the war stories about them, you have to kind of go out and find bits and pieces of the community. It's harder. It's not all available by the frameworks themselves. Here's an example of the Kotlin multi-platform. Just thought it was a nice thing for you to look at. I think you kind of follow what the logic is here. Here's some examples of what I mean by this. And of course, React Native is very, very popular. Flutter is used often in a lot of the paid gigs that I have done. I have done Xamarin since the beginning. That is now Maui. RubyMotion is actually pretty cool. Has anybody ever done RubyMotion? Nope. You should play with it. Our friends over in that language community have done quite a bit of work. And of course, the lovely Kotlin multi-platform. So let's say you're not really willing to commit to that much of a setup time. Maybe you want to do a really quick application. I'll give you an example. I had to make an app for the Super Bowl. They told me 4 weeks before the Super Bowl. I'm not going to build a native app in 4 weeks. That's just not happening. You know why? Because I still have to get through the App Store. And I still have to get through the review process. You really need just as much time to fix any issues in the App Store as you need for the last 2 to 5 sprints that you've done. And that's a lot of time. And they're not going to change the date of the Super Bowl. It's not going to move. There's no punting it. So hybrid WebView is a really good choice for this. So let's see. Let's talk about the hybrid WebView approach. For those of you who might not be familiar, this is essentially any kind of app except for Windows Phone, rest in peace, that wraps HTML and CSS in a native shell, okay? While it is installed like a native app, the views are built with web technologies we all know and love, right? What's cool about this approach is its flexibility. You can handle code locally or use a third-party service to build rapidly. You don't even need a Mac for iOS anymore. There are services that will render the .ipa file for you. Pretty nifty. Now, you might need a custom IDE or a plugin environment, but not always. And sometimes you can just use Bash. It's everybody's favorite, right? So this is very quick to do. It really depends on your setup and the framework that you choose. The pros are, of course, turnaround time is incredible. I'm building an app in 20 minutes kind of speed, especially if you leverage an LLM to help you with that, right? That's pretty decent, wouldn't you say? Many frameworks offer remote builds of your code for each platform, which is super convenient. You also get to use your favorite front-end styling and DOM elements. I know we all love that. Anyone here familiar with Ionic? Yes? Okay, a few of you. Let me tell you, it's got some beautiful default templating. You don't even have to think about it. There's some stuff built in that just looks nice right away, which is nice for me because I just like data transformation. So I'm happy that there's some good default styling. The Ionic community in particular offers decent support, which is always a plus when you're diving into a new framework. Now it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Let's talk about some of the downsides. Those remote build services I talked to you about, they can get pricey, especially if you're doing a lot of builds, which you should be because we're all doing test-driven development, right? Access to device features can be limited. It's gotten better over time, but when I first started, there was a service called PhoneGap. Everybody heard of that from years ago? You were pretty much just limited to camera, keyboard, accelerometer, and maybe GPS. I mean, they're improving and getting better all the time, but it's still mostly just the common hardware features that they will test for you. And here's the big one, performance. You can usually spot a hybrid app by how it handles when you swipe or you zoom anywhere in the app. It's a little sluggish because it's actually just using your browser. And it depends on the browser that's installed on the app, by the way. Unless you're going to force a download of a particular browser, it's hard. There are some things that some of the hybrid vendors have done to build their own JavaScript engines and making sure that it can be baked into the framework. But again, that just makes it more bloated and big. Okay? Hybrid apps also have the highest probability of rejection from the App Store. I tried to get an actual percentage, but they wouldn't give it to me. Apple and Google always say that they prefer native apps, partly because they want consistent navigation experiences. And they can usually tell if an app was built with a particular hybrid framework. So while hybrid apps can be quick to develop, you have to weigh the cons carefully against your project's needs and your target audience's expectations before you make that choice. Of course, I've already talked about a couple of these, but I probably have personally used the original Apache Cordova the most. And nothing wrong with them, but this is the situation where you need something fast. It's so good for prototyping. It's also great if you have a new section of a website, let's say like a corporate website, like your frequently asked questions, and you don't want to have to do an API call. You can probably just wrap your site in a nice little native wrapper and serve it up there. And there are some optimizations you can do there, but that's a really quick way to like suddenly get FAQs. There are some airlines that shall not be named that did this exact thing and kind of forgot to cache those pages that they were loading, so then they would just disappear and you'd have a blank frequently asked questions section. So see, there's some things that you don't really think about if you're normally just building APIs or websites that are done for you, you have to now do. Here is a bit of the breakdown of the market at the moment. .NET MAUI is still going strong. Ionic is going strong, but React Native is huge, absolutely huge. I have done my absolute best to give JavaScript a fair shake. I'm just not that person, I think, ultimately. And I prefer Flutter, for sure, for app development. But that's just because I've done all of them. I've done them for lots of reasons. And I think Flutter just has a very fresh approach. However, if you already know JavaScript pretty well, it's a natural fit for you to go with React Native. I've got, again, this slide deck for you to download and lots of pros and cons and considerations between each of the platforms. And they're all not all different, right? So I came from a .NET shop. MAUI was a natural fit for us. But you know, sometimes it wasn't performant. Or sometimes I just couldn't get the emulator to work properly within Visual Studio. It was very frustrating. And sometimes we just jumped to something else entirely. And there is so many different framework characteristics that you need to take into consideration. And you should do it every time. Every single time. You should go back and look at, does this make sense for the time I've got, the people that are going to maintain this or build this? Does this make sense for the type of application that it is? I can tell you I'd probably never build a game in a hybrid web view, but there are people who totally have successfully built that. And it's just an interesting choice. Let's talk about mobile web approach. I'm really just talking about responsive websites. Okay, that could be the whole slide. But I've been looking around your town and here in London, and I've noticed many of your websites are still not responsive. Even now. It actually has gotten so bad that browsers now ask you, do you want to make this a mobile-looking site? They're taking matters into their own hands, slicing and dicing the content. The problem is it's very opinionated about content placement and scaling and often doesn't do a very good job for you. Of course, Android and iOS browsers can access these sites without installation, so that's great. You're working with one code base in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which easily integrates with your backend APIs. You can develop this on whatever computer you want. And yes, you can even send push notifications and access the camera from the web, although it's a bit limited on what you can do in which operating systems, but there are lots of options for you to do. The great part about this is it doesn't require a download, and this is huge, folks. Every step you ask a user to take decreases their trust and their ease in the process. Think about it. If you make them jump through hoops just to use your app, they may not even like you before they've even used it. I'll never forget the first time I went to a restaurant, made me download an app from a QR code in order to use another QR code on the table for my table number to then go through the process where they only had one type of payment checkout, which wasn't saved in my wallet, so then I had to also set it. It was just like a whole process, and I was getting frustrated and I haven't even ordered anything yet. So one of the best parts is that there are libraries now that let you add mobile app-like features. You can implement touch detection, swipe gestures, and really make it feel like it kind of belongs on the device. You don't have to go crazy and trick users into thinking it's native app, because there's obviously a URL at the top, but you can certainly enhance their experience. Of course, there are downsides. The touch response is typically slower and more sluggish compared to a native app for a lot of reasons. Again, I'm going to use the airlines as an example. The airlines say, download our mobile app. I'm like, why doesn't your website just do what I need to do? Why do I have to have every airline's mobile app in order to even use your boarding pass? Why can't I just use your site? Because they've optimized that, and the website experience was not optimized. So oftentimes they'll have separate steps than the mobile app for the whole process. I will also use the UK's ETA app as another example. You can go through a website experience for people who are outside of your country to come and get a visa waiver. Or you can download the app so they can take a picture of you within the app and submit it through a nice flowed process that doesn't exist on the site. So your experience with getting that visa waiver is very different depending on what you had chosen, and I wish they were just married a little bit more together. So mobile web obviously solves that problem. You're still thinking about a mobile device, but you still need an API call anyway, so you might as well not make them download an app and just have a nice experience on the site itself. But you're at the mercy of internet connection, which can impact your performance. There are some caching around that you could do. And there's also very limited JavaScript libraries for accessing some of these device features. We can do a lot with web technologies, but we still can't fully replicate the native app experience. I chose not to do this approach for the fintech app I'm writing because, in my case, it meant that we wouldn't rank on the App Store, and it wouldn't be a suggested app for people. I would just be cut out of that whole search engine optimization experience that the app stores have if I chose this approach. So finding this would be more difficult, this experience, for our consumers that were using this app. So that's the reason why, while this is great, and I think everybody's site should do this anyway, sometimes there's a real legitimate reason to have an installable app, and maybe it's just reach. Maybe it's ranking, and you want to be seen against a competitor, and you have to go where they rank. All right, so all of you have gotten in your head which approach you're doing, right? We've followed so far? Yes? Let's conquer it. I guess I should let you look at the picture. That's your comic relief for the day. All right, let's tackle the question that sparked more meetings in my development career than any other. What do we do with the data? As you can see on our slide, we have three main options for where the data can live: on the server, on the device, or both. Have you already picked your choice? Yes? Let's break these down. If you go with server-side data, remember that security is really important here. And Apple, and of course both, really require that all server data has to be sent over HTTPS. And this isn't just best practice. I mean, it's a requirement in order for it to be done. Storing data locally on the device also might seem appealing, because you might think, great, I can just miniaturize my .NET application and use SQLite. That's what I'll do with this. But pause for a moment. Consider how much data you're dealing with and how often it's being edited. Is it being edited, or is it just being ingested? Local storage is not always the best solution. The third option is to sync, between the two, and often the most flexible, but the most complex. Tools like Azure Mobile Services, Firebase, all sorts of different kinds that are set up for this can make it easier, providing real-time database structures that are relatively lightweight, but the crucial question is to ask, is syncing even necessary? Every sync operation uses the user's data. If your app is being used in areas with limited internet access or expensive data plans, constant syncing could be a major drawback, and that, again, leads them to uninstall your app because of how much data it's consuming all the time. I'll often talk about data chattiness. With mobile, it's never a good idea to constantly be chatting with your server. I know that it's done for chat apps. It also is the most resource intensive, and that's the first thing that will cause somebody to run out of their monthly plan that they have with their telco. And that's the first thing they'll do is uninstall your app. This brings me to how I truly define a mobile app. Can it work offline? That's my first question. If the answer is no, I don't think it should be a mobile app. Because what is the point of it being on there? I know, there are caveats, okay? There are caveats. But many banking apps, for instance, cache your last known data for offline viewing, but some of them don't. They just don't want anything on the device. It is server only. In the end, your data strategy has to be driven by your app's specific needs and your users' conditions. Next question is, where are the data calculations and business logic handled? Here we go again. The decision can be very divisive in a team. A team I worked with previously, many mobile developers insisted on handling all business logic in the app because that was fun and they got to do it there. If I chose the native approach, what does that mean? Here's an iOS team did this and the Android team did this. Do you think they got it completely the same? They completely read every single JIRA ticket and did it the same, right? Because they have an opinion about how to structure that, because of the best practices in their frameworks or the way that they have come across it. And they didn't expect to have to walk every single step of their thinking with the other team who isn't even doing things in their language. Some teams are awesome at it, but a lot of teams are not very good at this. And there's always like some sort of divisiveness about what makes sense in terms of where things need to be shared and where they're not. There are cases where this makes sense, though, to put everything in the app code. Remember there was a solar eclipse earlier last year that happened? There's a very cool app that tells you if you're in the totality zone, all offline, because a lot of the time you're in the middle of nowhere where this is, and you're not going to get any reception anyway. So everything was preloaded onto the device and just kept there. So it could tell you exactly where you were in the process of the solar eclipse. It was very cool. That's a good example of why you'd want to put all your business logic there. Most of the time, though, it's unnecessary and inefficient to handle all the business logic on the phone. That's where other options come in. There's also that third option, using third-party APIs or installed applications. This is a powerful approach that is often overlooked because it's not fun for us. I want to build the fun stuff. Again, sorry, the example of some governments deciding we're just going to build our own access to the camera, even though there's a default camera app in the phone for all phones, and you could just do an API call that says, hey, go give me a picture, and whenever you're done taking the picture, give it back to me. Instead, usually our governments are like, no, we can build that from scratch with terrible buttons that don't have editing functionality, and you had to decide about resizing, image resolution. That wasn't even the main point of the app. That was just one step of the process. Utilize what's already on the device. Obviously, the first thing we think about is the sharing option in an app. Like, okay, share to this app and that app. That's an API call. That's a third-party API call saying, I don't know, whatever apps say they're social, bring them to me. Do that for as many things as possible, because oftentimes the user will have a lot of apps they just prefer using, and that's functionality you do not need to build. By making smart choices here, you can create more efficient, maintainable, and user-friendly apps. Now let's tackle a crucial decision in mobile app development. How do you want to create the user experience interface? We got two approaches, not three. You can either have a common UI or code them separately. The first approach, using a common AI, sounds great in theory. Frameworks like Maui allow you to write once and render native controls across platforms, but there's a catch. When major hardware changes come out, like a new Samsung phone or a new iPhone, suddenly the controls look different. They take up different amounts of space, the default color scheme is different, and they behave differently. So you'll end up having to override and separate the UI anyway to accommodate these differences. Oops, back. There we go. There we go. Yeah, we got it. In cases like coding it separately, Xamarin Forms is a really good example of this back in the day. Works well for apps that where functionality just trumps the appearance, you don't really care about that. Think we have something called Craigslist out in the States, if you're familiar with it. They haven't changed their UI in 20 years. It looks the same boring marketplace as it's always been. And people don't care. They still use it. But what if you're building something more complex? So I once worked with a major car manufacturer on an augmented reality experience of driving their sports car. It was fun. For that, we needed custom controls that varied per device. In cases like this, investing time in separating out the experience per platform does make sense. So when you're deciding that approach, consider the importance of that consistent look across the both platforms, or if you really do want to utilize the differences between them. Let's talk about the crucial aspect of mobile app development that often gets overlooked: security. Because as the saying goes, you never know who's out there with a slingshot aimed at your app. At my previous company, we were fortunate to have an ethical hacker whose entire job it was to break into our apps and find vulnerabilities. But I know that's not the case for everyone. If you're working solo, as I did for years and I am doing now, thinking about all the ways your data could be stolen or your app exploited can be overwhelming. And when we talk about weaknesses, it's not always about the catastrophic data breaches that often you see in the media. Sometimes it's as simple as a cheat code in a game, okay? Imagine you have created the next Angry Birds, and somebody reverse engineers your app to get extra points in the game. That's one way you're exploited. It might seem harmless, but it's still a form of hacking your app, okay? The good news is you don't need to hire somebody full-time to be an ethical hacker. There are so many freelance ones on platforms like Fiverr, or maybe just the people you went to school with who would be delighted to try and break your app. You just simply give them access and ask them to find vulnerabilities and do it in your alpha and your beta stages, both. And then, of course, when you go live, offer a reward system for that. If somebody does find a vulnerability, instead of actually exploiting it, reporting it should always be rewarded if you can. There's a growing market of ethical hackers, and it's an excellent resource for people like us. So as you develop your app, keep security in mind from the start. It's not just about the functionality and user experience. It is about protecting your users and your hard work from potential threats. Then you've got to discover where the weakest links are. Usually it's at the ground level. You know, the stuff you wrote in the beginning usually has your weakest links. It doesn't make sense that it would be that way because we spend all this time preparing for it, but because once you build it, you kind of leave it alone. And this project just continues, and you didn't really think about how you put that together. Sometimes it can erode depending on what you built on top of it after, and it's usually that's the foundation, which is why I say I think mobile apps need to be like baby waterfall approaches, so you can kind of think a little bit ahead of where you might have to fix something. You could incrementally test your code with platform emulators. This is a good free option and a great starting point. But remember, it usually deteriorates the fastest in mobile development, the code that you write. So write tests that make sense for you and can catch issues as you go. Don't wait until you built the whole application. Test incrementally as you go. Or you could just plug your device into your development computer all the time. This might cost you the price of a device or two. It also will slow you down a little bit in development, but it's crucial. I always felt really envious of my friends who were working on the website, and I was constantly waiting for my app to download to the device to test it out. Mobile app developers, you know. And then what happens when you need more than just that device? You've now carefully tested to make sure everything just runs on that one machine. But we all have different phones. Well, how do we deal with that? You could distribute to beta testers. You used to use TestFlight or the Google Play Developer Console for Android. Remember, you are just too close to this project to be an official tester in this capacity. Find your neighbor, your mom, professional testers. Consider using a paid service. There's options with Bitrise, Sauce Labs, Test Fairy. There's a lot. I use this approach for an equestrian app I designed several years ago. So for like less than $100 a month, I got professional testing, including the steps to reproduce, bugs, and really good user experience feedback. It's a great way to start, especially if you're new to mobile development. You don't really know what to look for, and the gotchas in the process. I once worked for a company that contracted to build an internal application. We decided to use a new cross-platform framework that I won't tell you the name of, that had just been released in beta. We were very excited about the possibilities, and I, alone, convinced my team that we could build this app in just 6 weeks. It's great. We managed to create something within that time frame, for sure, but we hit a major snag. The app would consistently crash on Android devices after a few uses. Interestingly, though, it worked fine on iOS. Does this sound familiar? This was a big problem because our client was heavily invested in Android platform because of their rollout that we talked about. I was pretty desperate for answers, and so I reached out to some developer advocates at the framework company themselves. They revealed kind of a crucial detail that wasn't in the docs anywhere. This new cross-platform framework had to juggle 2 different garbage collectors, one for .NET and one for Java, at the same time for Android. These collectors handled objects differently and on different timelines. Once we understood this, we just changed our approach to what we were doing, and instead of constantly redrawing a screen, we reused objects and just updated their content. So that way I didn't run into that problem as much. This did solve our crashing problem, but here's where it gets worse. In my desperation to fix this issue, before I reached out to them, I tried switching between garbage collectors and even attempted to write my own. I wrote my own garbage collector for this problem. Pro tip, don't do that. There are awesome people who spend a lot of time optimizing frameworks for this. I ended up crashing the iOS version too, because I did that. And we missed our deadline completely. Unfortunately, much like the Super Bowl, this deadline involved taxes, and those deadlines don't move either. This experience taught me 2 very important lessons. Always research the potential pitfalls of new frameworks before committing to them for your larger projects. And 2, sometimes the simplest solution, like going native, might be more cost-effective in the long run, even if it seems more expensive initially, because of how much you're hunting for bespoke bugs in that framework, on top of the bugs that you get in the ecosystem, and then the bugs in your logic. That's just a lot. By sharing these experiences, though, we can all become better developers and more informed about our decisions. Even now, as newer versions of the framework come out, I am now that pessimistic person saying, is that ready for me to ship to 300 million people? Can I use this? And I will look them dead in the eye. Is this really ready for prime time? Because if I make this decision, I am now committing this marriage of this framework to this outcome. And it's okay for you to play around with a proof of concept, but you're never going to get deep enough in a proof of concept to go through the stuff that we went through, because we just had more data. We had more complexity at that stage. And of course, Google and Apple were not helpful in this. They're like, oh, should have used native approach, could have answered your question. So sometimes it is better. I'd argue native is always better if you build a game, because you get just access to better performance. I am impressed by what the frameworks are doing, but if I'm going to build something that just requires a lot of that, it's nice to get the APIs directly. All right, let's talk about the final hurdle, publishing your app. It's tempting to think, great, my app is done. Let's just throw it out there and see what happens. But the publishing process is crucial and deserves careful attention. First and foremost, read the contract. I know you're not the legal person, but you need to read the contract. This isn't just a formality, it's about ownership. You might be surprised to learn that if you don't read and understand the terms of publishing on an app store, you may not even own your app. You have to be very careful about this. This is especially critical when working for large companies. The publishing landscape is always evolving. For example, in voice app development, Amazon updated its Alexa documentation frequently. While mobile app stores are more stable, they still introduce changes every few months that are not always documented, or at least not obviously documented. You have to stay on top of these updates or assign someone in your team to track them. This is great for your project manager to go do. If you're the project manager, find an intern. Here's a key point to remember. Rejection is normal. I accept rejection. I understand that sometimes I missed something. Don't take it personally. It is part of the process. Your app, which you've poured your heart and soul into, will likely be rejected the first time. That's okay. Build that into your timeline, and it's not going to be rejected once. It'll be rejected twice. It can be rejected 3 times. It's a rite of passage for mobile developers to go through this process of arguing with Google or Apple about why they rejected your app. So how do you plan for this? Just don't wait until the last sprint to submit your app. I typically plan for 3 rejection cycles. This allows time for the initial submission and rejection, making the changes and resubmitting, and potential further ones, and modifications. This is the stage where you feel really rushed. This is also the stage where, unknowingly, you'll fix something that Apple or Google has a complaint about, and you'll introduce a whole bunch of bugs by doing that. So please make sure you've got your tests in place and you go through that thoroughly. Sometimes the rejections happen because the store's agreements change. It could be related to monetary issues or tax structures, especially for like the in-app paid services you're going to do. The other thing that could happen is that they may not like that you are competition for Apple's watch face, and they're just not going to let you be there. You didn't plan for that when you took the contract to work on this $500,000 app, but here we are, because you didn't read the terms and what they've decided to do, especially if it's something that runs on one of their devices. They get to make the decision. It's not that way for, again, the B2B stuff, because you can just go to a separate site and have your users find it there. But if you're going to go through the formal app store, this does happen. All right, let me give you that wonderful architectural diagram that I put together. Trust me, it looked worse before. This tree asks 4 questions, and based on your answers to these questions, the flowchart kind of guides you to what development approaches. I get asked what to do for a project so much that I just send this now. Like, this is how you're going to answer your questions. Native is best for apps that need full device feature access and offline functionality, but it's more expensive. Cross-platform is a good middle ground that can access device features or work offline and be potentially more cost-effective than native development if you all are on the same stack. Hybrid is suitable for apps that don't need extensive device feature access. It can be done pretty quickly. It's often very budget-friendly. And mobile web is the most cost-effective solution and ideal for projects that mainly always require internet connectivity and don't need device-specific features or offline functionality. Remember, this is not a rule. This is just a guide. Sometimes the best solution might be no mobile app at all. And about 60% of the time, a responsive website is probably all you need. It's crucial to assess whether this will truly provide the desired results for your project. First, plan your approach in this process. But don't worry, I'm not advocating for a big waterfall, just a little one. You can still be agile, but some initial planning is crucial. If this is your first app, create a proof of concept. It doesn't need to be elaborate, just aim to build something basic in one day. Even if it's just a Hello World app, it'll give you a feel for the process of at least setting that up. This approach is far better than learning on your client's time, which could potentially damage that relationship. Keep your initial version simple and small. Consider data transfer and storage constraints. I always say that smaller is better. Even though we have lots of data storage that's cheap, it's not often the right answer to do a very chatty app that has just a lot of data going back and forth. Be mindful of how much you're using that internet connection, because you might run somebody's data credits out for their telco. Allow several weeks. Measure 10 times and submit your app once. Rejections are swift and hard to reverse, so thorough testing before submission can save you a lot of headaches. It's fun to stress test on low networks, going through putting it in airplane mode or leaving it there and seeing if it's not in airplane mode, but you just drop. I often will go like down in a basement somewhere where there gets no reception anyway and let the natural drop-off happen. It's fun to do. Take a field trip to the countryside and call it a team bonding day that you're going to do while testing your app out. Keeping these points in mind, you'll get pretty well prepared for the challenges of doing mobile app development. And remember, the attention to details can make such a difference between the app that succeeds and one that struggles in the real world. Lastly, don't get sandbox. Just test often and early. This is probably one of my favorite quotes in the world, and I thought I would share that with you. Remember, it's really just a little bit of attention to detail, and it can feel overwhelming. Refer to the slides if you want as you're doing your project. I'd love to hear about your pain points and your successes at any time. Thank you very much.